thanks for coming out. Thanks for being part of SABR, and special thanks up front to SABR for helping us put this together. Special thanks to Keith Woolner. You saw Keith with his introduction of Gary Huckabay earlier. Keith was instrumental in putting this all together, managed to put himself not on the dais, but have to keep him going. I'm Will Carroll. I worked at Baseball Prospectus for 10 years, but I was not a founder. These are the people that built what Baseball Prospectus was and is to this very day. So I'll start at the closest and start with one question each. Who were you before that helped create what you've built now? This is Clay Davenport.
Well, before this started, I was a student at the University of Virginia and then came back as a graduate student. Had read all of Bill James, Pete Palmer thoroughly, and was just, I guess, young and arrogant enough to believe I could do better.
On his right, Joe Sheehan, same question.
I was an unemployed guy who had a lot of opinions about baseball. No, I met a lot of these. I met everybody here on Rec Sport Baseball, which is a pre-World Wide Web section of the internet that we just get on there and argue. And I became close friends with Rany Jazayerli through playing Stratomatic, and that was my entree into the group.
Dr. Rany Jazayerli, same question.
Yeah, hi. So I get this question a lot from aspiring people who want to work in the sports world. You know, what's the secret? You know, how do I get in? So I'll tell you guys what I tell them. Step one, go to medical school. So yeah, I was a first-year medical student at the University of Michigan when Baseball Prospectus started, but I had gotten to know these guys online in college through Rec Sport Baseball, where we just argued about baseball at a level that of discourse that you literally could not find anywhere else on the planet. Like most of these guys, was indoctrinated through reading Bill James. I was fortunate enough to be just old enough to read his final abstract, and I've never done drugs, but I suppose this is what LSD is like. It kind of opens up your brain to a whole new reality. So, and yeah, just arrogant enough to think that I could, write about baseball while going to school at the same time.
And on Rany's right, Christina Kahrl, same question.
Yeah, I was a graduate student in history working in archaeology publishing when I discovered Rec Sport Baseball and met most of these folks. I was also an avid Stratomatic player, and but I had learned, unlike everybody else, I think, in terms of growing up with Bill James, I had grown up and learned how to win at Strat from reading Weaver on Strategy. And so my focus was 3-run home runs and as many of them as I could get.
And on his right, new Lifetime Award winner, Gary Huckabay, who was really instrumental in putting the team together.
Gosh, I guess the best way to describe it was I had the cushiest job in the world at UC Davis. My job was to help teaching assistants deal with Scantron tests, which includes things like putting the piece of paper here and then watching it go through. It's pretty complicated, but it left me a lot of time to do whatever the hell I wanted in my job. And so I went to Usenet, of course, and spent pretty much, I would say, without hyperbole, at least 65, 70% of my time at my real job was spent on Rec Sport Baseball, and refreshing to see if a new post had come up. And if it came from Roger Maynard, I wasn't going to read it. It was, it was what it was. But it left me enough time to do this. And one thing that I really enjoyed was the Bill James Player Ratings book, which only came out, I think, for 2 or 3 years. And it wasn't particular. There's not really statistical analysis in it. It's more just like the part of BP that lists the players, and there's a blurb. And I found it to be, I really liked it. It wasn't heavy or anything, but it could be on the coffee table for a little bit. And then you read 5 or 10 guys, move on, take it with you in the car when you go a road trip or whatever. And I really liked it. And then when I found out they weren't doing it, it's like, well, that sucks. I want that book. And so I started going, well, you know what, maybe I can put it together. I mean, the business world had completely forgotten about baseball. We're still coming back from the strike. And there's nobody out there. There's no aggregated capital about to do anything interesting. So I went to Rexport Baseball and said, okay, that person can write. That person can write. That person can write. No, not so much you. And the going around, and there's people that, there's something at Rexport Baseball that you didn't see anywhere else. And that was a separation and a different viewpoint for the analysis and the writing. And there are very few people that can do both and do it really well. But together, this actually could work. And so we started it. And I remember vaguely dealing with the printer and stuff. And Joe had actually had kind of taken the reins and dealing with the printing and all the other stuff. And to get the book in the first year, you had to read the signature file of one of us and send a blank check, was it, to Joe Sheehan?
1995.
We did start, okay, because we didn't know how much it was going to cost. And so I remember thinking, well, so send this check for $20 to this guy you've never heard of who might be fake. It was what it was. And things started coming together. And I remember getting a galley copy of the book and thinking, okay, I'll read through this. I'll see if there's any errors. And so I'm reading through it. And I hit a patch of about 12 pages that were in a Cyrillic font. It's Russian. I'm like, what the hell is this? Go through, and we found all sorts of weird things that need to be changed. And so we finished all that stuff. The QA's done. And I remember, who was it? It may have been Rany that emailed me something about, were we going to put in the St. Louis Cardinals? Yeah, we were going to do that. So Joe, do you remember how many copies we sold of that first book?
It printed 250, sold 180, 190, something like that.
Okay, thanks. But anyway, that's where I was, and I had some talents that I've been through creating companies before a couple times. And so I kind of knew what the parts were going to suck and that no one was going to want to do, like doing all the initial outreach. It's like, asking, I remember mentioning, okay, maybe Clay could get on the phone and call some of these newspapers at random. No. Oh, okay. Well, never mind. But anyway, then I just filled in some password and that was it. But that's what I was doing.
It's hard for people to imagine, especially people, most of which weren't alive when this started, to imagine what baseball was actually like, much in the same way that for you, what happened before Bill James is almost unimaginable. What's the biggest change, the one you didn't see coming, if we could go back to 1995 you? Let's start with you, Christina.
The biggest change? I think, we did not anticipate the growth of the internet, in quite the same way. As a consumer, I was consuming baseball in the same way my great grandfather, who was a friend of Mel Otts and Bill Terry and knew the New York Giants extremely well, but I was running out to the stoop to get my newspaper and I was listening to games on the radio. So as a consumer, there had been no change in almost a century. And so the way in which the internet essentially literally changed everything for us in terms of, as we figured out in 1996 very quickly, the book, we created a website to sell the book. And then we realized, not as quickly as we should have, but in a couple of months, we realized, oh, maybe the internet is a bigger deal than the book. And that really kind of stood what was our initial business model on its head.
Now, that point about 96, 97 was where things like Usenet were going away and moving into the World Wide Web. Was that just accident?
The web was just more accessible.
Yeah.
And for a lot more people. Usenet kind of was a corner of the internet that you needed to use text-based, commands to access. A lot of people just you can't imagine what it was like to have to type in all the commands you had to do then. But yeah, once Netscape was 95, 96? Yeah, once you had graphical browsers, it kind of really wiped out a lot of that stuff.
I mean, it was definitely serendipitous, the timing there, because the World Wide Web, you had AOL, you had certain walled gardens CompuServe and AOL, stuff like that. But finally it was the internet was open to the public. And like I said, there was a graphical interface. It just seemed like the obvious next step for us. But yeah, like Christina said, I don't think any of us anticipated how quickly it would change things.
Clay, what's been the biggest surprise for you over the 30 years?
Oh, well, I never would have thought that strikeouts would take over the way that they have. Even though, I mean, that was one of our big pushes, strikeouts don't matter. And boy, was that taken to heart. Sure, the internet, the money, which, I mean, which increased a lot faster than inflation. And just how much bigger everybody got. I mean, the players are all, the players, the Willie McGee type players from the 80s when I started doing these stat things, and probably some of these other people were also starting to get involved. Those guys are basically extinct.
Yeah. Joe, I'll ask you the same question.
We collect data now. You guys use and present data now that we couldn't have fathomed back then. God, Baseball Reference would update once a year. I can remember waiting for the Bill James handbooks to get platoon splits so we could use them in the analysis. And now, as we speak, they're collecting the spin rate of every single pitch that happens in Major League Baseball. It's the idea that you could, we were excited when, like say, Reference would start operating daily, or we got our data for working on the book in October instead of, November. And it's a miracle. It's a baseball miracle that we can collect the things we collect now. It's astounding to me. Things like steam shifted wake, which would have been, to use Gary's term, Cyrillic in 1995, now are just part of the vernacular.
Yeah. Do you feel there's a crossover problem? Because you mentioned spin rate, and the change from me walking around campus with a Big Mac, which that only makes sense to a few people here. There used to be this giant baseball encyclopedia, reprinted every year, and it must have weighed 50 pounds, but I would carry that around. Now Baseball Reference does everything and more, and thank God for Sean Foreman.
Will, you realize that in the early years of this, to get some of our historical records for me to work off of, I was hand entering. I mean, I would read out of the Big Mac and just type player statistics in. Probably 500 players done that way with their full career lines.
Exactly. Well, today we're talking spin rate. We have the spin rate on every college pitcher. We have, what their pitches do and how they move. We don't have a single pitch for Nolan Ryan. And that's not that long ago. If we look at Justin Verlander's early career, we don't have the same data for it. With that kind of data access, do you feel there's going to be a problem looking back? If we're 30 years hence, what are the problems that we see? Does it hurt historical analysis to not have the same data? In the same way, we've got box scores from 1884. We don't have spin rate from 2004. Rany?
I mean, definitely, it's going to mean that historical analysis is always going to have a shroud of mystery to it. Maybe that's not a bad thing necessarily. I don't think, knowing what knowing what Nolan Ryan's spin rates are would be, I think, really just interesting because it's Nolan Ryan and because it might be the best of all. Was he? I mean, there's the Netflix documentary arguing that he did in fact have the best fastball, in history. But in terms of analysis going forward, I think so much of what we've done has always been looking to the future and looking at the present through the window of the data that we have available. And the one point I want to make, the thing I really didn't anticipate, this might sound a little self-serving, is how successful we were in the sense of I would have considered it an incredible success when we started to have half a dozen teams employ an internal, an analyst in the organization looking at data. Like the idea of having one person who was devoted, their full-time job was data analysis. In 1995, that was a pipe dream. So to get to, the post-Moneyball era, and by 2010, and almost every team has got maybe one person, to now where we are today, where a 10-player analytics department is probably smaller than average. I never anticipated that. And everything that we were talking about here about the amount of data that we have, that's all downstream of the seriousness with which the industry took data analysis and realizing how much you could help them to win. And that's just begotten more and more data and more analysts
Yeah.
look at that data.
I think the smallest analytics department actually in Major League Baseball right now is 14, I want to say. So like, when the A's were tied for last and they moved up with a couple of hires this winter. So it's 10 would be cheap by current standards.
Yeah, not to bring the mood down, but I do have to mention, there's somebody not with us tonight that would have been on this group, and that's Doug Pappas. Can somebody talk about his importance to what baseball is today?
Well, Doug was the person, I think Gary, you could probably get into this as well, but I think Doug, like by really kind of starting the analysis, he was just as important to Prospectus as he was as, the chair of the Business of Baseball Committee for the Society for American Baseball Research. He was really one of the great inventors of, basically in terms of like pricing out, dollars spent per win and looking at team budgets and really kind of making us think about there is this other scoreboard that is not on the standings, but is how people, are using their money effectively and, whether or not they're making money. And so really kind of bringing very early on, Gary, I think your perspective on the business of baseball was important to all of us because I think we were kind of more just narrow-minded in terms of looking at results on the field, but like you and Doug, I think, helped us start thinking about we should be thinking about the money because that's the thing that really matters to the people who are signing the checks.
Right. And the interesting thing for me was Doug was also, he was a damn funny guy. I would love to be on the phone with Doug for quite some time. And I found out that he had passed from Billy Beat. And I was in my office, which was overlooks the Warriors home court at the time, Oracle Arena. And he said, he poked his head in and said, "I'm really sorry about Doug." What do you mean? And Doug who? Well, Doug Pappas. What about Doug Pappas? He passed away. And I was stunned. My advisor in graduate school is Professor Scott Davis. And he graduated from Stanford, was a graduate student at Stanford and worked for Roger Knoll. So this is something, and this stuff is marinated in most of my, thought process almost all the time. And I couldn't believe it, but Doug looked at things differently. He was the one that told me that I was a complete idiot because I didn't suggest to the players that they take the revenue split. Because I had no idea I would be willing, along with millions of other people, to pay $200 a year to watch baseball on my phone. I did not see that coming, but to an extent, Doug did, and that was actually pretty damn prescient on his part.
When I think about Doug, to me, he and Gary are two of the turning points in terms of the credulity with which we cover the business of baseball. Brian, cover your ears. There was a time when we basically what was made out to baseball fans was entirely the ownership line on everything. And Doug, and I'll cite Murray Chass of the Times here as well in the 80s, and then Doug and Gary online and what we did at Prospectus. A lot of the coverage that we see today, which is a lot more questioning and a lot less critical of the players, stems from this era of guys like Doug and Gary kind of saying, "Hey, wait, this is the truth. You gotta look deeper."
Although I will say, having chewed out the AP editors, like when we saw the last lockout, I'd say, oh God, what is his name? The AP reporter, Sam.
Ronald Bloom?
Yeah, Ronald Bloom really took a hardcore pro management spin. And so letting AP's editors this shit shouldn't fly. You should not You're supposed to be the Associated Press. You should not have your reporter lining up and just repeating, like owner's spin and not even questioning it. We should be better than that as an industry. They did not like hearing this, but it has to be said. And so like the fact that we're now at that point of having this kind of conversation where, no, you know what, if you're literally going to be a management tool, then you should be called out for it. As a journalist, the audience deserves better.
Taking it back to the history, and I'll start with you, Gary. When did you realize this was going to be bigger than just a couple of guys on a Usenet forum? When did you realize this was actually going to be a business that might be here, not just 5 years from now, but almost 30?
Actually, almost right away. When I had my doubts about how things were going to look, and then Joe kept editing, I think, the initial book. And if I remember correctly, I came down to LA, and we basically were just talked about the book and kind of looking at things. And over like just even the first few weeks, I was like, this is actually really going to be good. This is going to be entertaining. It's going to be educational. And I was pretty jazzed about it. Most of my reticence about it came from I didn't know how we were going to successfully monetize it. And I didn't see micropayments or the Patreon model or something like that would actually work for us. And so we got a product that has about a 6-week lifespan that we don't make that much money on. And it really serves primarily as a big old billboard in a bunch of bookstores for our name. But, financially, it was not a situation that I was, I thought financially we're going to be in trouble, but from a product quality perspective and making people happy, we're going to do good.
Speaking of the name, that's something that's always, I remember getting asked and having to correct people. Who chose Baseball Prospectus?
Not me.
And what were some of the alternatives that might have been suggested?
Well, Baseball Prospectus was kind of like the working title, then it somehow ended up on the cover of the book. But there was Clay had the Baseball Farmer's Almanac, and I remember thinking on the phone, I thought I wanted to work with this guy. We had nothing. I mean, and most of the time, also like the first time you're dealing with some media outlet, radio station somewhere, newspaper, they invariably would write it as Baseball Perspectives. Dude, you're kidding me, right? So there was that, but I don't even remember any of the other ones except the Baseball Farmer's Almanac.
No, Baseball Observer, and we decided we did not want to be BO.
A new look at baseball was my really bad idea.
Yeah.
Baseball in Progress. I remember somebody threw that out there. I think Joe said that sounds like something that would snarl traffic on the 110 at 4 p.m. So no, I can say pretty certainly that Gary came up with the name Baseball Prospectus. Just I remember an email. It's like, how about this? And then there was kind of that mic drop moment. It's like, yeah, that works.
Fine, whatever. Yeah.
Gary, did you consider Big Bad Baseball?
Yeah, I think someone else is doing that.
So over the years that you were with Prospectus, the years afterwards, Gary, you talked earlier about having to do late night radio in Bend, Oregon. I've done too many of those to laugh at those anymore. Was there ever a moment where you realized, wait a minute, this is a thing? Not just that you were going to be able to do it, but other people were actually listening? I'll start with you, Gary.
I'm trying to think what those gears you hear are. I don't know. There were times when I went both ways on it. Like that is not the case, and this is never going to work. And the people that I thought would be, the very first person I asked to be part of Prospectus shot me down in like 2 seconds. Like, no, I'm not going to do that. Go away. Oh, okay. And that was Sherry Nichols. She was the first person I invited. And there's one other person I invited who turned it down, called me back I think it was 9 years later, and said, you know what, I've been thinking about it, and I think I want to join BP. And that's a guy named Dave Tate. So, but there are times, and also it's not like this all works. Instead, it works like, you know what? It works pretty well if we have Keith working with Joe, or it works really well if we have Rany working with Gary, or whatever. There's a lot of those that, you know, they really did find a fit. And those were really, and so, you know, we tried, or at least I tried to like nudge people in that direction. And sometimes it worked, but when it did work, it was pretty special. I liked it a lot.
Christina, do you have a standout moment like that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just go to the fact that within 2 years of the launch of BP, I think I was doing Cubs and White Sox pregame and postgame shows on like, you know, on their broadcasts. And because I was the person in the island in Chicago and BP's Midwest. But suddenly, like, how official were we? You know, I was sitting there with the studio host, like, talk every night instead of, you know, somebody, some ex-player or something, and talking about like what's going on with the Cubs and what's going on with the Sox. And, you know, like totally, and like, you know, essentially being at a moment's notice, like, hey, there's a rain delay and they're on the road. You want to come spend 3 hours in the studio talking about baseball? Yes. Yes, I absolutely want to spend 3 hours in the radio on TV talking to both of your viewers during the rain delay. But absolutely.
It's you or Andy Griffith. Joe, you have one of those?
I'm still waiting for it. Well, I don't know if this prospectus thing is going to work out, so I'm withholding judgment. Now, I got asked to do an in-studio interview at something LA radio with former major leaguer Jim Gott and a second person who, to the life of me, I can't remember, but it was an in-studio, come in and talk baseball with us in the early days, you know, 97, 98, something like that. And it was like, oh my God, I'm going to talk live on the radio. But yeah, that was the, oh wait, this is a bigger thing than I thought it was.
Clay?
I guess mine would be, so in 2000, 2001, I worked out how to do a translation for Japan because we had Ichiro Suzuki had been signed, and I worked out, you know, how to get an approximation for his statistics, which was noticed in Japan. And for the next 10, 15 years, I had a regular gig with NPK where they would, the Japanese television would have somebody come out and they'd do like a 15-minute hour segment with me at every preseason for the next 10, 15 years after that.
Amazing. Rany?
Well, I think the big time moment for me, right around the time we were launching the website, again, 96, 97, that's when all corporations were doing the same thing, including ESPN. And ESPN was just starting. I don't think they owned their website.
No, Starwave.
Yeah, Starwave, ESPN, that Sports Zone. But they hired a daily baseball writer by the name of Rob Nyer. And there's going to be a huge generation gap here between people who know about where the name Rob Nyer means something and it doesn't. But Rob introduced probably more people to analytics than even Bill James. Like he was Bill James' assistant a decade earlier, but he wrote daily about baseball in the way that we were doing it and was a big fan of Baseball Prospectus. And it got to the point where I remember when he was going on vacation, and so he asked for a number of people to be guest writers for him. He asked me to kind of fill in. He's from Kansas. He was a Royals fan like me, so that was our connection. But I think Rob, you could see in the way that Rob's popularity, Rob's sort of fame grew exponentially between like 1997, 1999, and he carried that wave. And through him, we got the ability, Baseball Prospectus started writing articles for ESPN. And that's when it was like, wow, we've gone national.
Yeah, you lead into two of my next questions with that. And it was like, who were the biggest champions of Prospectus? Who I know Rob was, obviously. Were there any others that stood out for anyone that really pushed the brand early on?
I can't say enough about Peter Gammons. At a time when a lot of writers were rejecting this stuff, rejecting the work we were doing, Peter Gammons was like, this is new, this is cool, I'm going to tell my readers about it. And to this day, you know, Peter's out there championing young writers, you know, younger writers. I he's the guy. I think probably Billy is probably the second guy on that list, but for me, Peter Gammons is number one.
Yeah, and you weren't terribly kind to Gammons early on, if I remember correctly.
I don't know, I'm not terribly kind to anybody. I don't.
But
Dwayne Murphy. Not Dwayne Murphy.
do any of those stand out to you, Gary?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Do you remember any columns that might have taken Peter to task?
No, that never happened. Yeah. Actually, to answer the question about who were some of our champions who are out there, we got a lot of help from the producers and directors of broadcasts all over the country. Specifically, Mark Wolfson, who was with the A's at the time, invited me to come down here. And I think this was in '97, and sit in the truck and have them, watch the game being directed and stuff. And I couldn't talk during the game, but we talked a lot after the game. And he said, well, I think there's a lot of stuff that you guys are doing that we could use. And I'm going ahead and recommended you to Dave Coppett, who is doing these games and will doing the Giants games starting next year. And I said, okay, well, I know Dave Coppett, so I'll give him a call. And they, then we would get calls and emails from producers of college baseball games, a lot from the late season folks directing and producing NBA broadcasts. And I'm trying to remember, was it '95 where even the finals for the NBA were not even televised live, if I recall correctly. They were on tape delay on CBS. I'm like, wow, okay. But I may be missing the year of that. But they ended up, you get a call from, I talked to this guy at WFAN in New York, and I talked to, Cindy Warren in Cincinnati, and they said that, we had Rany Jazayerli on and people liked him. So it's sort of like, what other options do you have available? Okay. And that they really pushed a lot. And I actually think we had kind of what's the best way to put this? If you take a look at what effective political campaigning is today, you have one political party that has made the decision that what they want to do is go negative. And because it works for what they're trying to do. And you saw the same thing. I don't think we saw anything like what we saw when we had, Dallas Green calling me a jackass on the radio. And it's like, well, he can call me a jackass all he wants, but I might not always be a jackass, but he'll always be incompetent. And so, and that kind of thing drew a lot of attention. I mean, I think that specific gag got me on. There's a syndicated show that lasted quite some time, but it had a national reach. And so I think they were based out of Baltimore, the Don and Mike show. And we ended up saturated through pretty much every secondary and tertiary market in the country. That stuff didn't have anything to do with baseball analysis to speak of. I mean, in fact, I would try to throw something in on Don and Mike show, but the ratio of what I was supposed to say to keep the audience thing was basically 1 statistic and 4 dick jokes. That's it. And that was their thing. And they, people sucked to them. When they started to get emails saying they wanted to hear more of me and so on and so forth. Okay, whatever. So, but yeah, we had a lot of champions in the media and in the kind of, well, also every hedge fund guy that I ever met had somewhere in their office a BP. And it's like, oh, got that, huh? Yeah. And then also learning that on the website, we have these geographic anomalies. It's like, who the hell in United Arab Emirates is particularly interested in what we're doing, and how are there this many of them? And then you eventually find out by talking to someone that comes to a pizza feed in full Saudi regalia. It's like, why does this sell over there? And he's like, oh, well, because you guys have the umpire report. Well, why would that matter? have you actually ever gone to this website where you can, all these baseball propositions are there? No. Dude, it's printing money if you have the umpire report. Oh, because almost all the propositions that they play are plus minus total runs for the game. And so you look at a guy, and if it's Eric Gregg who's behind the mound, or who's likely to be behind the plate this game, or it's Doug Harvey or whoever, they control that number more than the pitchers do, more than the hitters do. And no one seems to pay any attention to that. They always say, oh, Pedro Martinez is pitching. Well, no one's going to score any runs. Except that, the guy behind the plate believes the strike zone is it should be metric, maybe smaller centimeters or something. So, but that was really fascinating too. And I had never even considered that kind of gaming market, but maybe others did.
I would definitely have to give a shout out to Dave Schoenfield, who was the page 2 editor at ESPN, and who was, along with Rob, one of the people who made sure that we ended up with a very early ESPN presence.
RIP page 2.
Yeah.
And I feel like if we're talking about our champions, it would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the guy sitting 10 feet away from me. Brian Kenny was maybe not right at the beginning, but when we talk about national TV was sort of the apex of exposure. And, it all started with, print and even radio, but to get to a national TV presence, Brian was phenomenal in promoting us and having people like Joe on national TV and giving us the opportunity to do television, which is, not everybody can do that. But that gave us
Not even me, just to be clear.
In terms of influence, there's two ways we could go with this. There's obviously the people that came out of Baseball Prospectus, whether it's Keith or Dan Fox or James Click, or there's tens, dozens of people that have been everything from writers to interns to data people that have gone into baseball. But is there something where you look at it today and you say, I sowed the seeds for that? I'll start with you, Clay.
Well, let's see. Free true outcomes. What was an early VP. I think it was pretty.
But my one contribution to the English language that shall remain memorable. So, yeah.
That was certainly a big one. I don't know, somebody else want to kick in?
Well, I mean, when you ask why pitchers are being pulled out of the game in the 5th inning all the time, I can't take full responsibility. I don't want to take, but pitcher abuse points probably started us on the road of getting pitchers away from throwing 140 pitches in an outing and blowing out their arms when they're 22 to now throwing 90 pitches in an outing and still blowing out their arms at 42. So, sorry.
Gary, you have one?
Not really. I just know that there was, a bunch of things that were I was more ancillary to them. I was very busy mismanaging the company at the time. And yeah, for those of you also, if you ever need an editor for something, I think I'm your guy. So you definitely want to look into that. So, because I know all the important rules, like make sure you never check your reporter sources with the same source. So if I have one guy that says, hey, guess what? Pete Rose is coming back. No, you got to be wrong. Oh, go ahead and check into it. So I do. And of course, I end up talking to the same guy. It's like, yep, that's right. Yep. And that was a lot of fun. And I remember driving from Roseville up by Sacramento back to my home at the time, which was Concord, I believe. And then I hear on KHTK out of Sacramento, and Baseball Prospectus is reporting that Pete Rose will be reinstated. It's like, what? We're reporting? Oh, and it was interesting. A lot of phone calls on that. I just no, I'm not picking up the phone. I kind of know how that conversation will go. So yeah, I'm thinking of a number between 1 and moron, and it's not 1. Oh, okay. So
I'll own that one. In terms of where you think this type of thing is going, you couldn't have seen it back in 1995, 96 Where do you see it in 2036, 2046? Joe?
Brian was doing the panel earlier, talking about strikeouts and getting the ball as one of your solutions. I feel like we're in a position of incredible transition right now in the game and trying to balance the entertainment value versus trying to win, which is not something baseball's really thought about a lot until recent years. So I have a hard time predicting what the future will bring because I think MLB is going to have to take a very firm hand. I think there are right answers there and there are wrong answers. I occasionally have opinions about this. But I don't know, Will. I want to say that it'll be data driven, but based on what we've seen in recent years, I'm not entirely confident. I think if they go with a data driven approach, say this is how the game is played, this is where the issues are, this is how we fix them. I'm pretty excited, but I'm less confident that the people who run the game are making these decisions than I am with, if you just gave me a random sampling of BP or Fangraphs writers, that they would get the answers right.
Christina?
Yeah, I think the major change will be in journalism, where I think with the generational turnover will eventually catch up, and the idea of being a data illiterate journalist is going to be almost inconceivable in sports journalism. If you're just somebody who's like great at telling a ripping good yarn or a really good reporter, that's good as a start, but you just fundamentally have to be data competent.
Clay?
Yeah, there's, in terms of like what we're likely to see going forward, Joe Sheehan has a word that he put together that actually says quite a bit in, one thing, and that is that baseball is really, really good at anti-marketing. And this remains true today. I know there have been a lot of changes like this, but take a look at what they've actually chosen to do. The first thing we're going to do, because we have, all these issues with the game is too long. People, they can't sit still for this long. Well, if we start treating them like, meth addicts, then no, they probably can't. But think about this. They've got this game going on, and what do they do once they get to the postseason? And this is going back a few years now, but the postseason, when people are starting to actually pay attention for the most part, the first thing they do is extend the time between innings to either 2:30, 2:45, or 3:10 instead of 2 minutes. In other words, here, have some more television ads. This improves your quality of game, right? And then they start adding in a bunch of other stuff that is sawdust in a hamburger. It doesn't make what's you're seeing on the field any better. It just gives you more inventory. Guess what? With less and less demand, you really don't make any more money. And right now, if you go talk to most of the finance people that I know that are actually in OCB or with a club, they're just absolutely convinced that no matter what, we absolutely must come up with a way to cut game times down. And 162 games, you don't need that many. 154 is much better the way to go. So your idea, when your revenue is exploding, you're terrified of competition from football, which to me makes no sense, but okay, let's say that. Then what you want to do then is somehow, what is better here? What are you actually improving? And take a look at your revenue, for God's sake. It's just absurd. Why don't you invest and do some things? And with the NFL is they found a great partner when they signed the Fox deal so many years back, and Fox came to them, and I forget who was the guy at the NFL at the time, and said, yeah, we focus group the hell out of these NFL games, and we find that what you need is some animated robots. But it works. And so I kind of wonder, what are we missing here? And how come baseball doesn't have a partner like that?
Yeah, they built their own. Clay, do you have one?
Well,
I was going to say,
I think the internet built it for them.
Yeah.
And I think I understand that perspective, but to me, that's a little bit like the, rooster taking credit for the sun rising. I'm just not convinced. And yeah, I'm not a big Rob Manfred fan. So just for
I was going to say that I think we're heading into an era, and with a lot of the analytics that you've seen here this weekend, of getting incredibly fine-grained into player performance in ways that can actually feed back to the player as to what he's doing, that we may be approaching an era where every player on the field is essentially working at their absolute peak performance level, which is something that we've really never seen before. I mean, players have always had flaws. They'll still have flaws because there will be things that different players are not physically capable of doing, but they're all going to be, living up to their full potential.
Rany?
So to me, the first quarter century of what we've been doing, I think baseball, the industry has been marked by teams using data and analytics to make their product better, meaning their team better. By the end of that quarter century, every team in baseball is using analytics. And so they're all competing against each other. So, it's a zero-sum game, obviously. But the point is that teams either adapted, got better, or they didn't adapt, got worse, got fired, and were replaced by somebody who would adapt analytics. And so, I feel like the next quarter century, the same drive to succeed on a team level that we saw that made all these teams embrace analytics, I think needs to be adopted by the league to make the game better, right? Because we had these conversations going back to like 2000, 2003, that this idea that if a baseball team adopts our ideas, they're going to be successful. If every baseball team adopts our ideas, the game itself is not going to be as exciting. It's going to be more walks, more strikeouts, more home runs, fewer balls in play, and balls in play are the exciting plays in the sport. So we were having these discussions 15, 20 years ago, and it's really just in the last 5 years that baseball has finally woken up to the reality that strikeout rates are out of control and that we're not seeing enough action on the field. And we've just seen in the last 2 to 3 years, really, the rule changes, obviously the pitch clock being the biggest one, but everything. I mean, I don't necessarily think that banning the shift is fixing anything necessarily, but at least they're acknowledging there is a problem.
Right.
And I think that's where the next step that the sport needs to take.
Exactly. Okay, we're going to take your questions, and while we're collecting the microphone, I want to acknowledge one other person that's not up here. Everybody knows Keith Woolner, but not a lot of people know Dave Peace, who's done tons of work behind the scenes and has meant as much to Baseball Prospectus as anyone. So if we could pry that from Gary, we'll start taking some questions.
Gary?
Yeah, you got it.
Hand it to somebody with an arm. Yeah, that would not be.
Questions? Anyone? Come back there, Dave.
Thank you for mentioning Earl Weaver on strategy. Weaver was a genius. I'm going to propose he was a genius ahead of his time. He had insights into baseball that it took analytics to come and bring to the rest of the field. If you disagree, let me know. But have all the insights been found? Is there no room left for geniuses to figure out how to run a baseball team? And if that's the case, what does that mean for the future of baseball and the future of play on the field?
Christina?
Well, I don't know. I belabor what I fret over the way in which baseball definitely seems to have changed the job of being a manager into almost kind of more of a communicator. The manager ends up being the media face of the team. That ends up being the person most accessible to the reporters, the person who's the source of the majority of the quotes. And these guys, almost to a man, are great at saying nothing at length. And so and in depth. I mean, I will always point to Gabe Kapler as an example of somebody who could talk for 15 straight minutes about something, and he's got a lot of intent, and you really think you might have something useful in there. And then you listen through it, and it's just dross. There's nothing there. He's literally not said anything of value, but he has used up your time. And that's an important part of his job, is to make sure that you're not bugging the players and you're not actually doing an interesting story. You're instead regurgitating this verbiage that he has just spewed out that is designed for TV, is worthless on the page, is uninformative to you as a reader. And you got 30 of those guys who are all good at that. And you have, I was just talking to Brian yesterday about, like, it's a sin that Ozzie Guillen isn't still managing, because Ozzie at least is authentically Ozzie.
Are
He
you
isn't.
serious? He's still managing?
No, Ozzie is not managing.
I was
That's
gonna
petty.
Should have been beaten to death by now.
And it's sad because you end up with 30 clones of people who say nothing at length. And so, you know, there are people who are tactically ambitious, but they're not going to talk to you about it the way Earl would. They're not going to talk to you. I mean, I still think, again, in my career, like spending a day with Earl Weaver and interviewing Earl to write the new postscript to that book and his retrospect on his career was one of my favorite days in baseball. And I've been to World Series. I've covered a bunch of things. I've interviewed great people. Like, my conversations with Earl and Minnie Minoso are still my favorites because they were genuinely themselves and they had a lot to say. And these guys aren't telling us who they are. It's kind of sad.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say I reject the premise. I think the next genius is probably in this room. There's never going to be a moment when we solve baseball. We haven't solved baseball. We've solved a version of baseball. The rules will change, the players will change, the equipment will change. And it's going to be the people in this room who then say, well, no, here's how you solve that particular problem. And when that problem is solved, everything will change and we'll solve the next problem. But I don't think the evolution of baseball thought has an end.
Yeah. Any more?
If there's going to be some sort of thing that should be abolished aside from the committee of owners, there's a lot of stuff in there, but the things that's going on is going on at a much lower level than Major League Baseball. You know, my son worked out at this place called Mike Murphy Baseball. And this is a location where parents are bringing their kids for real, actual instruction, not the dad that will ruin your swing forever in Little League. And what they're coming in, they're investing thousands upon thousands of dollars trying to get their kid into college with a scholarship. And they're getting, instead of the guys literally being teenagers from the local neighborhood coming in as hitting coaches, you're getting guys that actually know how to swing the bat. And they actually know how to field and they actually know how to do this stuff. And the kids that are coming through this, I mean, good Lord, I remember I was a pretty good ball player, but you got to be kidding me. These kids are amazing. And more and more and more and more, it's that pyramid it just gets, you know, that much harder to go up. And that level of quality in terms of the ball players on the field is going to, you know, it's going to change things a lot. It's going to open up doors for managers that don't happen now. So I'm really interested to see what happens. That will be fun.
Right.
And also, this one more thing is I actually came from a phone call I had with a couple of finance guys from an unnamed club, and they were going over some stuff, and they wanted to talk to me really quick. So we talked, and it's like, well, we're having trouble with, you know, we're seeing a huge drop off in sales here. It's like, okay, well, let me help you with this. You took your game and you decided to shorten it by half an hour, and now you want to know why you're not selling as much beer? Really? That's your question? Okay. You know, it's there's going to be things like that, you know, and the owners committee, of course, will go, oh, well, we need to do something to get that money back.
Raise the prices on beer, right?
By the way, you guys, for those too young to remember this, a few here, you guys, you're so refreshing, you're so funny, so acerbic, and I miss the golden age, I guess, of baseball writing, because you all had a sense of humor, yet it was pointed. And I've asked you different times when we've had conversations, but I haven't talked to Joe about it. What's the future of, you know, if you want to call it sports journalism? Where does it go? Because I didn't anticipate it going where it's gone now, and yet it is. And I think we all like search for better baseball writing. And it's not, maybe it was time and place. You guys were at the right place, right time, and it happened. You're all creative people. But again, anyway, just to applaud all of you. You did great work for so long. I want to say that. Looking toward the future and the new dynamic, given that there's a lot of team-owned content, where do you see it going?
There's a company out there that's, I think, really going to be the future of journalism. It's called Alden Global Capital, and I think they've got a lot of good ideas. We handed out some awards earlier today, and I want to mention Robert Orr, won for his, I believe, it was the Seeger research. And it's guys like that. It's people looking at all of this new data we have and saying, this is the next step. I'm a big fan of Ben Clemens over at Fangraphs. I don't suffer for lack of insight to consume. I think there's plenty of it out there. I think it's complicated by the collapse of sports journalism, and it's going to be harder to get paid for it, I do think. And I think there's a business level problem, but I don't think there's a shortage of insight out there. The tone is certainly different, but you got to remember, I mean, it was 30 years ago. It was a different world. The people writing now write in a world that was changed by the guys up here. So, you don't need to necessarily be that acerbic, not that that stops me, but you can kind of take a different tack because it's not the oppositional forces that it was in 1995, 96, 97. There's a line in Sam Miller's Fantasyland that is F. Joe Sheehan, which I really want to be on my tombstone. You don't get that anymore. The analytical writers have a level of access and they do incredible things with it. I think about Eno Saris, who I believe was here yesterday. There's a generation of writers that didn't have to live through that conflict, and they're out there doing incredible work. And I understand what you're saying. Like, the stuff that we did isn't really done anymore, but the markets move past that. So let's embrace what it does with what Patrick and Ginny do at BP, what Jay Jaffe's still doing at Fangraphs. I mean, there's just a lot of great stuff out there. So no, I understand what you miss, but I don't bemoan the loss of it, and I just embrace what we have now, which is just an incredible amount of writing talent out there.
If I can jump in on this one, I think there's the lack of outsiders. Access journalism is a huge thing, but people don't understand that we could not get access. We had to pound the table, press pass, no way.
Yeah.
Talk with a player, couldn't happen. They would fight it. Talk to somebody in a front office, you had to do it off the record. The idea that we would have this kind of data that would allow us to do it without it, okay. But it was the fights for years with the Baseball Writers Association just to get in. Those were the ones where it really took grinding down. It was an erosive battle, not a combative one.
Do you think that made you better though? Like, even politics, like, again, if you get embedded, you're corrupted. And look, I know I went to the league. It's where the food is, but it's like, but you're shotting from the outside.
Yeah, there is no more of, there's almost no more of that. And I'm not saying the people with the insider access are corrupt. It's just different. I don't think we have. I was talking to Aaron Schatz, who runs Football Outsiders, or did, and he was an early partner, early, but he was kind of the Bill James of football. And he was talking about it. He was like, "There's no outsiders anymore." Even if you've got a blog, you can get a press pass. You can watch every game. You get the all 22 access. We've got MLB TV now. I can watch every game everywhere at any time on my phone. We didn't even have phones. So it's one of those where, maybe we should just say Baseball Prospectus happened 10 years before the iPhone, and everybody go, "Oh yeah, okay."
Well, it's thanks. I don't feel old now, Will.
Yeah, it's that kind of thing that is really how these people changed everything. And I don't mean everything. I mean everything.
I also think that there was a life cycle to kind of what, the snark that we had in the 90s was fresh, but it went rancid pretty fast. I know I got tired of writing snark by the early aughties, where I was just like, I don't like being snarky. I'm an asshole. I don't want to be that person anymore. And that had a couple of different meanings in my case, but in particular, it also, I think we saw it develop with other writers, take Bill Simmons, and what that, I think it kind of metastasized and became this ubiquitous feature of online commentary in sports, like in the Audis, that kind of ran its course and kind of like ended up just, eating itself. And in a sense, like what happened with, like what it enabled or created. Like, yes, it also produced great journalism, but it also, I think we saw it play out, like, with the ultimate fate of Grantland. And I think that we're still like dealing with the fact that the audience wants information in smaller bits. They do not want the 3,500 word essay. They want the 800 or 1,000 word essay. They don't have time. I mean, attention spans have changed, and user habits have changed. And so, like that creates a dilemma for like people who are creating content. How are you going to keep people's attention, and for how long, when they are consuming like literally every ball game because they're all on their phone? It's a different dynamic, and one that I think in terms of creation, was it fun at the time? Yeah, but again, you can wear it out, and you got to find a different way to look at it.
I just want to say, I mean, I think it was very easy for us to be acerbic and snarky and even rude, because there was never an expectation that the people we were criticizing would ever read our content in the first place. I mean, and that's a big part of it. I think looking back, I don't think I would have written a lot of the things I wrote about players in a very mean way if I thought there was any chance they would ever find out. And it's not that it was a secret, it was that we operated in an alternate universe. Like
Coward.
Yeah, well, guilty. But I mean, there is the classic quote from Gandhi. It's not actually from Gandhi. I did some research into this, but they say, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. And I will say, I think the five of us, we've really lived that entirely. It's very true, because before there was the fight with the BBWA, we still had to be even acknowledged by, so we were operating in a world to throwing, rocks from 100 miles away. Nobody even knew we existed. And it was that transition to, wait a minute, they're listening to us now, that I think altered a lot of the style that we were, that we were using in our writing.
Still remember the first time Billy Bean like picked up the phone and said, if anybody was going to write something nice about my picking up Mario Valdez, I thought it would be you. And I'm like, well, no, Billy, I still feel like what I wrote, it's Mario Valdez. Who are you kidding? Like, so.
Yeah.
This is a little bit more of an ideological question, but with the recent rise of sports betting, what do you think like analytics role should be with like the consumer of sports betting?
I think the role should be in telling people that betting is going to lose you lots of money in the long run.
I'm sorry. At last summer's APSE, Associated Press Sports Editors Conference, I was there in Las Vegas, and the Las Vegas Review-Journal was the host. And they had, like, I'd say half of the panels were about like why you need betting content in your newspaper. And I'm like, thank you, no. Oh, and here's another panel. No, still thank you, no. I do not want to print your, like prop bets that you could make you some money. No, you know what? No, I know this is how you keep the lights on at the Las Vegas Review-Journal, but this is not where I want the San Francisco Chronicle to be. This is not where I hope journalism goes. And thank you, but no.
Thinking about Gary's story about his friends in the UAE. I think the data is the data. People are going to use the data. However, I would never want to restrict access to data based on how somebody's going to use it. And it's interesting because I've actually in my work started to do that kind of content. Prospectus hasn't in the modern version. And I think it's an interesting conversation. Like, do you give into that? Because frankly, guys, that's where the money is. So do you give into that or do you not give into that? I've made the decision not because I have sponsorships, because literally my readers are saying, I want to hear this from you. So that's the pressure to do it. But this might be one of the big questions of the next 10 years. Like, how do we integrate gambling content or how does baseball navigate this world where everybody's betting? You had the situation with the college baseball coach earlier this year, or excuse me, I guess a year ago now. This is going to come up more and more. There was a story this week about Temple basketball, possibly. This is now going to be, you go back 100 years. Brian, you'll remember this. And like gambling was a big part of baseball. It was just guys in the stands betting with each other. Players were throwing games all the time. And that pretty much ended in, I won't even say the Black Sox, like into the 1920s it happened. But it hasn't been part of our lives in 100 years, but it's coming.
Yeah, as an early investor in FanDuel, I think it's gonna be big. So any other questions? One over here? Charlie, back here. Come on, all those lessons
shout.
didn't pay off. Nice catch.
Can you go over to Rocky's camp? Because I think they could use it.
The Rockies say thank you.
Pardon me?
The Rockies need you.
Oh, yeah, pass. So I'm embarrassed to admit that I have yet to go to the Hall of Fame. However, I was a docent for the Baseball in America exhibit. And so I'm well aware of how great that institution serves as a museum. It was really, really powerful. The Hall of Fame, though, my personal feeling is that it's losing credibility as a way to memorialize the best careers in baseball. And as a Tigers fan who was 8 years old in 1984, the most egregious example of that is leaving Lou Whitaker out of the Hall of Fame and not bringing him in with Alan Trammell. So my thought is that the Hall of Fame should be a Hall of Fame. So it's where we go to memorialize people who were famous, like Fernando Valenzuela, and not necessarily who had careers that were up to snuff or whatever. And we find some other way to memorialize those careers. And so I'd like to hear how each one of you feel about the Hall of Fame and how you feel we should go about memorializing the great careers in baseball. I need some water.
Anybody?
I no longer care about the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
I don't, it lost me in the last 15, 20. We used to have really interesting debates. You mentioned Whitaker. And it just lost me over the last 15 years because it's turned into a regurgitation of, arguments we were having 20 years ago. I realize this is an awkward place to say this because of the name up there, but that guy did more damage to baseball than since anybody since Chick Gandil. If you look at the collusion in the 1980s, you look at the negotiations in 1994, and the fact that he went into the Hall of Fame pretty much ended my relationship with it. So.
Anybody else?
I remember having this exact conversation, like warning you that Bud Selig was going to go to the Hall of Fame, and you were like, "No fucking." I was like, "I'm telling you, no," and I was like, "It's not a question of merit or like should they or will." I'm saying they will, and they did.
Rob Manfred will be in the Hall of Fame.
Yep. No. Well,
think of the influence.
No. Well, I mean, in foreshadowing again, when they put what's his name in the year before, it was ridiculous. But again, when you're putting shitty commissioners in the Hall of Fame, but the problem with speaking as a Hall of Fame voter, my problem with it is that essentially how it's become this acting out by the writers in terms of avenging themselves over missing the story on PEDs, and it's like, well, okay, but this process shouldn't be about you. It should be about, and whether or not you were somebody who was loving Sammy Sosa in 1998 and then suddenly magically is now going to, line up with, a fail son like the Ricketts du jour, owning the Cubs, saying Sammy Sosa owes me an apology. No, he doesn't. He doesn't owe you an apology. He played, the players, the fans loved him. They loved what he did. This isn't about you owning the team and then wanting deserving something from a guy who literally made this franchise a ton of money and put a bunch of people in the seats and helped baseball recover from its self-inflicted damage from the strike. You shouldn't be here to punish and Sammy Sosa for being essentially a great ball player. Just embrace that Sammy Sosa was a great ball player. He puts the capital F in fame. He should be in the Hall of Fame. So it's crazy that essentially the Hall of Fame is now more about people saying well, I don't feel that's appropriate. And I don't feel that I feel that was cheating. And it's yeah, okay. Well, so are, people who were, again, the fact that they finally took, whatchamacallits out of, and everybody was taking stimulants all through the 60s and 70s. The number of players who probably also used steroids in the 70s, but just not as effectively as they did in the 80s and 90s, were already in the Hall of Fame. So it's just sort of okay, so now we're putting white people who we know use PEDs. Like, Jeff Bagwell, it's okay, but it's not okay because a person like Gary Sheffield may or may not have used it. It's just, at this point, it's ridiculous. It's frustrating. I'm going to keep voting, but I'm going to vote because I believe the hall should be big and it should be putting famous people in the hall.
We have to end there. Thanks to everybody. Thanks to everybody for coming.
Please let me talk. That's blasphemy. Blasphemy.
Last one.
He's got the yellow box.
Go.
He cheated.
Gotta be quick.
These guys cheated. It was more than stimulants. This was a big time cheating thing. They shouldn't be in. Sorry.
Question?
Yeah. My question is, how could you think like that? That's
Listen, once more, I want to thank these guys for coming, thank them for all they did, and thank you for listening today.